Good morning, Good News Chapel. So good to be with you. I want to start this morning with a question. I don't know if you've ever had this experience. Have you ever been in a country where you didn't know the language and you didn't know specifically how to read the signs? It may have been where you've traveled somewhere, or it could have been maybe immigrating to the United States and you didn't know English or something like that. But there's this kind of fear and this tension of like not being able to read the signs. Pretty soon, my family, we were getting ready to, we're going to take this summer, take a trip to Japan, something we've been planning for quite a while. Pretty excited about it. But there's also a little bit of trepidation in that I know almost no Japanese and a little leery about how we're going to be able to get around if we can't read the signs, whether it's train signs or menus, or even just, Japanese toilets are complicated things and there's instructions on how to use them, so it causes a little tension. It could be very easy, if you don't know the language, very easy to miss an important sign. I don't know if you're familiar though, I found this amazing bit of technology, these apps now on your phone that will, through the camera, be able to actually translate a sign. All you do is lift your camera up to the sign and it'll translate whatever it is into your own native language. And it's amazing. I'll show you a couple examples. I was just practicing with this. And so I had a picture. Here's a picture of Sign Hill here in South City. We all know this South San Francisco, the industrial city sign. And then I put the filter on it to see how good this would work. And so the first one you see here is that sign translated into Hawaiian and Korean. So if you know those languages, you'd be able to understand that. And then I did it again in the language of Laotian and Filipino. I'm not sure exactly if it's Tagalog or some other dialect, but just called it Filipino on my app. And maybe again, you could possibly read those. And then I took our sign, the sign that we have in front of Good News Chapel, and took a picture of that and had that be translated into Japanese. What would it look like if our church was in Japan? Well, that's how the sign would read right there. And finally, just the title of Good News Chapel. And how do you say that in German? And I'm not quite sure if I can pronounce it. If you know German, you can do it. But it's just a really, really cool app that translates and just makes it so helpful. I bring this up because today we're back in the Gospel of John, John chapter 6. And it's this famous story of the feeding of the 5,000. But what's important to notice is that twice in this passage, it mentions that the signs that Jesus is doing. And this word signs comes up a lot. And John himself, the author, is going to give many additional signs, things that he's trying to tell us about who Jesus is and his kingdom. And it's signs that I think are very obvious to Jesus' audience and also probably obvious to John's original audience that he's writing to, but maybe not so easy for us to recognize. So I kind of want to use the biblical app, or I don't know, some kind of that idea that we would kind of wait and see what signs are being talked about. Let's jump into it. We're going to read today all 14 verses of this narrative, but we'll only end up really studying the first 9 verses. But I want to read the whole thing just to give context to it. So here we are in John 6, verses 1 through 14. It says, "After this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. And a large crowd was following him because they saw the signs that he was doing on the sick. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Lifting up to his eyes then, and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, 'Where are we to buy bread, so that these people may eat?' He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread wouldn't be enough for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, 'There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many?' Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they had eaten their fill, he told his disciples, "Gather up the leftover fragments, that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, "This is indeed the prophet who has come into the world." So there again, we've had the whole story. We're going to just look at really 2 parts this morning. First, the first couple verses where it said right at the beginning, in verse 1, it says, "After this." And that kind of gives us a little question and context, like after what? After chapter 5, if you recall, Jesus was in Jerusalem, where he was there with the religious elites and religious officials, and he had kind of this contentious encounter where he had to defend his authority to heal and defend his authority as the divine Son of God, and to explain his intimate unity with the Father, and that how he and the Father are one and they are united in this family business, so to speak, of bringing redemption and salvation to mankind. So now that was the big thing. That was all of chapter 5. And so now it says, after this, after that chapter 5 contentious event, Jesus retreats in a sense. I mean, he goes almost as far away as he could from Jerusalem to the remote, desolate region beyond the Sea of Galilee. Perhaps he does this to, just to go find some solace and some rest from all the activity and contention that he's been through. But what happens, ironically, is that instead of being alone, a large crowd has gathered, a massive crowd actually, of people who have now followed him all the way out across the Sea of Galilee into the wilderness. And notice what it says, that the people follow him because they saw the signs he was doing on the sick. It's not just that they saw the miracles of healing, but they saw those miracles as signs pointing to something bigger, something farther along about who Jesus is and why he's come. And John here, he lets us in as well. He gives lots of signs that maybe we didn't pick up on the first time we heard this passage or when we read it. But John is giving us lots of signs that he wants us to pick up on. The first sign is to notice that Jesus is leading a large group of people, and it could be, we don't know exactly, but probably somewhere between 10 to 20,000 people. I mean, it is a massive crowd, and he's leading this massive group of people into the wilderness. That's the first sign John is trying to cue us in on. Does that remind you of anybody? The second sign is that in the wilderness, Jesus is going to miraculously provide them with bread. That sounds familiar. And all of this takes place, John points out, on the Passover, the celebration of God's deliverance from slavery in Egypt through the blood of the Lamb. Interesting detail there, interesting sign that's pointing out something. And then did you notice there was this slight detail where John says it's the Sea of Galilee, but then clarifies it's also known as the Sea of Tiberias. Well, which is it? Is it the Sea of Galilee or the Sea of Tiberias? Well, they're one and the same, but it's kind of this subtle reference to the fact that Israel is a nation that is under occupation by the Romans. Tiberius is the second emperor of Rome. And so Rome, when they came in and invaded and took control and, and dominated over Israel, they decided, well, we're going to change the name. We're not going to call it the Sea of Galilee. We're calling it the Sea of Tiberias. And so I think John's reference is kind of a reminder that all of this is taking place under the shadow of an empire, of an oppressive, dominant force that is wreaking havoc among the people of God. And then, unlike the powers of religion in Jerusalem and of empire in Rome, here comes Jesus, who comes as a healer and redeemer to set the people free in the grace and the power of his kingdom. John is giving hints all over the place that Jesus is in fact come as kind of a new Moses. All of these are signs back from the book of Exodus and pointing to something significant about who Jesus is. And in fact, the last verse, if you saw that, the miracle of the feeding is a sign that confirms to the people, it says in verse 14, this is indeed the prophet who has come into the world. And when John says that, the prophet, that's a direct reference to Deuteronomy 18 that says, one like Moses will rise up and lead the people. That it's a reference to the prophecy that someday a prophet like Moses, but in fact, as Hebrews says, one who is even greater than Moses, will rise up. And that's who Jesus is. That's the signs. It's all pointing to Jesus being the Messiah, the anointed one, the eternal divine Son of God who has come to bring about God's kingdom. John's going to continue. This is not the last time by far that he's going to make this kind of reference to Jesus. And we'll see it throughout the gospel, that Jesus is one who has come, who is greater than Moses himself. But what the question, though, is, okay, that's cool. It's kind of neat to see. I can see the signs, but what does it mean? Okay, so he's greater than Moses. What does that mean for us and today and how we live? Let's read on. Go back to verses 3 through 9. Look what it says. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Lifting up his eyes then, and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, where are we to buy bread, so that these people may eat? He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, there is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many? So here Jesus, he goes up on a hillside along the shores, and he sees with his own eyes this massive crowd that has followed him. And he realizes this is a teachable moment. It says that he's going to now use all this tension, this great need that's before him, and his disciples right there alongside of him as a test. He's going to test his disciples. But the question is, a test how? In what way? Well, Jesus asks the question. He turns to Philip and says, Philip, where are we to buy bread so that all these people may eat? It's a test of where do we go to find the resources to meet great need. Where should we go, Philip? And notice Jesus is right there. I mean, he's right next to Philip asking him this question. Philip, where should we go? How is it possible to find enough bread to feed all these mouths? And Philip is kind of blind to what's right in front of him. That it's Jesus himself asking him this. Do they understand? This is the test. Do his disciples understand who Jesus is as the Messiah, as the new Moses, and that his presence there in full compassion and abundant supply is able to provide for the greatest needs of our world? Are their eyes opened to Jesus as the King, and that his kingdom has come and is available and present and powerful right there? Now, Jesus knows what he's going to do, but he's hesitant. He's not quick to jump right to it. He's a good teacher, right? This is what a good teacher does. A good teacher doesn't simply tell you the answer right away, but instead what they try to do is prompt you to think. Think for yourself. They'll bother you. They'll try to tease out, lead you on a little bit to try to get you to think. Use your imagination. Try to consider. Have you ever had a good teacher like that? Teachers that really, maybe they bothered you in a lot of ways because they wouldn't just give you the easy answer, but they challenged you to think and come. It's so much more powerful when you come to the answer on your own than just being told. And that's what Jesus is trying to shepherd his disciples, is what he's trying to do with us as well. to stretch us, to get outside of our own limited imagination and thinking of how things have to work, and lead us into a new, bigger vision. Open the eyes of our hearts to see, man, oh, the King is here, and the kingdom is available and present right now. It makes such a difference. Jesus is ushering a clash of imaginations between what the disciples think they can do in their own strength and limited resources compared to what can be done in the presence and the supernatural power of Jesus. It's a clash of two different imaginations, a clash of kingdoms. Do they see and believe in the one who is right there with them? Or do they only see themselves and what they can do? This is the test that Jesus is trying to lead them to. And the question is, do they pass the test? Not really. But it's kind of humorous almost to watch how they go through the motions of trying to answer Jesus' question. You can almost hear the gears turning inside of Philip's brain as he tries to calculate. Maybe he's got an abacus with him and he's trying to figure out, maybe it's a spreadsheet or a scientific calculator to figure out how, okay, we got 15,000 people, 5 barley loaves, 2 fish. Or actually, that's Andrew who does it with the barley loaves and the fish. Philip just tries to think of money. It's like, wow, man, 200 denarii, like a year's salary wouldn't be enough to give everyone even just a crumb, even just a little bit. Man, it's impossible. And then that's when Andrew chimes up and says, hey, wait a minute, we got a little boy here who's got a basket with 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. I mean, it's the most meager of peasants' lunch. And a barley loaf is not like some big Raymond's sourdough loaf. No, it's like just a little bitty roll made of the cheapest kind of materials you can think of, barley. And it's kind of rough. And 2 little fish. The direct translation from the Greek there is little fish, like sardines. That's all it. It's like one person's lunch. And Andrew says, but Andrew's confession kind of sums up the futility and the cynicism of it all. What are they for so many? It's like, it's futile. And it's like, this is dumb to even consider it. It's hopeless. This is what happens when we just look at ourselves and just look to our own resources, to our own strength, what it breeds and what it produces. And what we see in our world is cynicism and despair and futility. And like, let's just give up. They are confronted with how outmatched they are in their own resources to even make the slightest impact on the greatest need. And Jesus is trying to lead them in this. He's willing to let them go there and kind of be confronted with the hopelessness of their own resources. Not to leave them there, but lead them to see who he is and to see there is actually a hope. There is a king who is with them. There is a kingdom with the full resources of heaven right there. And he's leading them to have their eyes open to see that the king is in their presence. It reminds me of the Exodus. If we're talking about Moses here, I think this whole scene reminds me of, remember in Exodus, the people were freed instantly. I mean, it would literally overnight, they were ushered out of captivity and into freedom and on towards the promised land. And that journey from the Red Sea to the river, the Jordan River, if you saw that on a map, if you went at a leisurely pace, it would probably take about 40 days to walk from Egypt to the promised land. And yet it took them 40 years. Well, why? Why did it take so long? Why did they have to meander around the desert for 40 years before finally getting to the Jordan River? It's been said you can take the slave out of Egypt, but it's a lot harder to take Egypt out of the slave. Does that make sense? You can take the slave out of Egypt, but it's a lot harder to take Egypt out of the slave. You see, they had lived for so long in Egypt and had so long breathed the air of Egypt, believed the consciousness, consumed the ideology of Egypt, the mentality of a slave, that it was hard to imagine a reality of freedom and hope and flourishing. It was like futile to even think about something like that. Like, that's so distant, so crazy to think. I didn't even want to put myself there. I'm just a slave, and this is how I think. And it took 40 years of wandering in the desert for God to teach his people that they are no longer slaves. You are now children of God. And that is a radical transformation. It's a radical new way of thinking. To get your head around that and to start to believe it and to live it and let it get inside of you and anchor your heart and wash your soul and transform your mind. I mean, this is what he's trying to do. It's the same thing God aims to do in each of us today. We live in a culture that is bombarded and breathes the air that ignores the reality of who God is. And we are blind. We are blinded by the bombardment of messages and just the way our consumer culture works, that we stay blinded to the reality of the King and of his power and of his kingdom that is available to us right now. He's right here. He's right with you, as close as your breath. And it's hard. It's just the air we breathe, right? We are stuck in a selfish, consumer-driven mindset that says there's a limited supply of resources and you got to fight for what you want. And life is about getting all the stuff you can for yourself and hoarding it and just finding security in your wealth, finding honor in your status, finding identity in all the praise of the world. And it never produces life. It only produces death. It produces cynicism and despair. And exactly, anytime we try to live life on our own resources and try to do just what I think I'm going to do in my own strength, it never produces joy, but only despair. And Jesus is here, just like he was in John 6, just like God did for the Hebrew slaves. He wants to do with us. He wants to free us. He wants to. I love Paul's prayer. I think it captures it the best, what Jesus is doing in the hearts and the minds of believers. Paul prays this for the Ephesians in Ephesians 1:17 through 19. He says, I pray that the God of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of glory, may give you the spirit of wisdom and of revelation in the knowledge of him, having the eyes of your hearts enlightened, that you may know what is the hope to which he has called you, what are the riches of his glorious inheritance in the saints, and what is the immeasurable greatness of his power toward us who believe. Did you hear that? Praying. I praise, may the eyes of your hearts be opened. You've been blind. Yes, you're walking around the world and you're kind of just living as the world expects you to live, but we live so easily, can be blinded to the reality of the King and of his kingdom. And Paul prays that your eyes of your heart would be opened so that you would see three things. He said there. He said you would see the hope to which he has called you, that we live with a living hope. I mean, real hope. What difference that makes. This world's got no hope. And so they just live for themselves. When we have real hope, we get to get out of ourselves and live for the kingdom. And two, it says, for the riches of his glorious inheritance. I mean, we got all this and heaven too. That's our security. Security is not in our wealth here, in our status, in our careers, in our stuff that's all going to rust. There's no security in that kind of inheritance. There's no inheritance at all in that. But in the riches of his glorious inheritance, if we could just get our eyes on that, man, it frees us. It frees us up from gripping onto this world too much. And finally, to the immeasurable greatness of his power toward us who believe. There is immeasurable power immediately available for our lives today. And I think that is where God is leading us as a church. He's leading me as your pastor. I'm still kind of trying to get my head around this. How do I live in the abundant power that's immediately available in Jesus for those of us who believe? That's exciting. A little scary, but I think it's really exciting. And for us as a church family to kind of walk together, learn how to walk in step with the Spirit so that we can really live this way. I want to believe this. I want to walk in this. I don't want to do religion. I don't want to just kind of try to jump through hoops, try to do what I can only do in my own strength, my own little meager resources, and try to work my way into grace. There's no life in that. Life comes when I say, God, I don't got much. I got a couple loaves and a couple fish, and I can't do much with that, but I can surrender it to you and watch what you do. Now there's an adventure. There's some life. If our eyes could be open to the reality of Christ's presence, it gives us a whole new imagination. There's a whole new economy, a whole new way of how things get done that is so dramatically different from our world. It's kind of like a few years back when Gregory was still in grade school. I don't remember if it was like fourth grade or something. And he came home and he needed some help with his math homework. And I'm like, fourth grade math, how hard could that be? And I looked at it and I'm like, oh, you got to ask your mother. I don't know what they're trying to do here. This isn't how I learned how to do math. And it's kind of like they say, well, this is the new math. New math? I thought math was math. I mean, this is not how I did it. But it was this idea like there's new ways of doing things that I didn't have an imagination for. There's a new way of doing life. The new math of God's kingdom is not like the math of the world. The economy of God's kingdom is radically different than the economy of our world. And the question is, are we going to live in the economy and the math of our world? Or are we going to have our eyes opened and say, no, I want to live in the reality of the King and of his Spirit and of the kingdom? I mean, that's a radically different economy and makes radical differences in the kind of decisions we make every day. Next week, we'll finish up this. We really only looked at the verse 9 for kind of the whole setup to the miracle. We actually haven't seen the miracle itself yet or talked about it much. So we will do that next time. I just want to leave us. What does this mean for us today? And I've hinted at this already, but we are invited into a faith that is not about what you and I can do in our own strength. Do you find that being good news? I hope so. It's tempting, right, to think that religion is about my own efforts, what I can do to kind of be a rule keeper, or my own discipline to kind of manage my sin, and that I'm just going to work at what my own resources to try to be good enough to be a good Christian. If you've tried that, you know how futile it is, and you know how suffocating and lack of life there is in that. And good news is we are not invited into that. This whole story, I think, points to that. Jesus isn't inviting his disciples to say, well, take your meager resources and go do it. No, he's challenging them to see how their meager resources are woefully inefficient to do anything. And so that their only hope is to surrender it and say, Lord, I don't got much, but what little I have, I give to you, and I want to have faith in you, and that you are with me, and it's your power for your glory, for your kingdom. And I want to believe that. We are invited to rest in the reality of the King and his kingdom that is present and available today, with the full resources of heaven to meet the deepest needs of our world. You know, I've often heard people say, many times I've talked with people, and they'll say something like this, you know, I don't think God will ever give me anything I can't handle. What do you think about that? God will never give me anything I can't handle. Well, I think this story that we just read shows that that's absolutely false. I would say it's the opposite. God's in the business of giving us things that we can't handle. He's constantly leading us to be exposed to how we are unable We don't have the resources. We can't do it in our own strength. And to be confronted and to confess that, not to leave us in despair with that, but to lead us to see that the King is with us and that in him there is real hope and real power. It's an invitation to a living relationship with the King who knows you and loves you and is closer to you than your own breath. And it's an adventure that we're invited into, not dead religion. It's a life-giving, moment-by-moment dependence in step with the Spirit kind of life. I'm still kind of unpacking that myself, and I'm excited to be your pastor as we walk together in this journey. God bless you, Good News Chapel. See you next time.